Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Cai Kjaer, who is the co-founder and CEO of SWOOP Analytics. We'll talk about SWOOP Analytics a little bit later, but as we start the conversation, Cai, can you tell me about your perceptions of the future of hybrid and remote work? We've been in this transitionary period. We've been trying to figure it out for the last couple of years. But what are your perceptions about where we'll be going in the future?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there's probably a couple of things for us to consider. We've made a huge transition in the last couple of years. You know, when people were working in offices, and now, well, I'm not saying everyone, of course, but there's a lot of people that are now working from home. So there's been a big transition that many people have made. But there's another part where we haven't quite finished that transition, and that's finding a way to work together in this new digital world, where the online world. And I think that's going to be one of the really big challenges that we need to figure out how to work. Because if we just check all the practices and behaviors that we have with us in the office and how we use the digital collaboration tools in the office, that's not going to work at home, because at the office we work synchronously, but when we are at home, we have to work in a different way.
Yeah, and that's definitely something I tell my clients. I've helped 21 companies transition to hybrid and remote work, and I tell them that the thing that they really need to avoid is trying to shoehorn office-based collaboration methods into hybrid and remote work. You need to figure out something that works for hybrid and remote work. Now, I know SWOOP Analytics has been all remote since its founding 7 years ago. So tell me a little bit about how you decided to become all remote in the first place and how that has worked out for you.
So when we started considering, we were doing the business plan and, doing funding rounds and you suddenly say, oh, well, we should have an office, we have to have an office, and you could real estate what it costs. And we said, gee, all right, that's quite expensive. And then, we had two founders, my wife and I, we said, well, it has to be close to us because we don't want to commute. But the third founder, he's, about an hour and a half drive away. And he said, well, I'm not going to be driving. We're going to have somewhere in the middle then. And we both, all of us agreed and said, well, actually, this is just going to be painful. Do we really have to work like from an office? Can't we do this from home? More economical, more flexibility. So that's how it started. And then I got very impressed by the people behind WordPress Automatic, and I read the book My Year Without Pants by Scott Bergen, and I thought, wow, okay, it's amazing, it can be done, and I was really inspired by that. So we've been copying them ever since.
Tell me a little bit more about specifically what you've been copying. So we started the conversation by saying that you shouldn't use the traditional office-centric collaboration and leadership methods in remote work and hybrid work. What have you done specifically to not use those traditional methods? What have you found works for you in remote work?
So I guess we are a software company. So I'm going to be very careful to say that everyone can do what we can do. I think every software company can, but I'm not going to talk about other industries. What works really well is that for software, everything is quite, at least on the development side, it is quite task oriented. And even though there is a fair amount of collaboration, you don't have to sit next to each other to do that. And actually, most developers probably prefer a level of quietness around them. And typically, they hate open offices. You always see them with their headphones on, noise reduction, because they really have to concentrate. So it leans itself quite well to remote working. And then we get people together. But interestingly enough, we only get them together we pick maybe 2 or 3 times a year, but only for social reasons. So we actually, the first couple of times we got together, we said, oh, let's do a workshop and let's do some work now that we're together. And we found out the work is much more effectively done remotely. But what you can't do effectively remotely is to socialize. It feels very awkward to say, oh, Gleb, let's just, I'm going to call you on Zoom and we'll just talk. It's just it just doesn't come natural. So face to face, get together for social, but work, even brainstorming, is actually much better done online.
That's interesting that you mentioned that social doesn't work. So that the typical social that you said, the I don't know, Zoom parties certainly don't work. But there are things that my clients have found do work quite well remotely. So, for example, there are things like virtual escape room experiences where you get together with other people virtually, remotely, and you try to escape from a virtual escape room. Or you can do video gaming together. So doing video gaming together is a fun activity, chatting a Discord server or whatever. So there are a number of activities that I have other clients who found that you can actually do remotely. And it's not simply because they only want to work remotely. Some of that was because they're distributed teams. So I was working with a Fortune 200 high-tech company that had distributed teams, and they previously to the pandemic, they weren't really trying to figure out how to work remotely. But now that they were figuring out, okay, how do we work remotely more effectively with these distributed teams? How do we help them socialize? So it's not simply about remote work, it's also about distributed work, where there's some people in San Francisco and some people in Singapore and some people in Nigeria. So how do you get them to work, to socialize and connect in that way? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Oh, I can definitely see that being something that people would really enjoy. We have I guess we also, I guess you can say, socialize online through discussion groups. People share stories about what they're doing in their personal lives. We're sort of quite a social company, so there's a lot of sharing of just about yourself and what you're doing. But we haven't, and I'm not sure whether it's a cultural thing or what, but we haven't, we do for our annual sort of end of year get together. We've played Kahoot and we've done some of those things. And that has seemed like a very natural thing. And people have, well, it's my impression, certainly people really like that. But we did try for quite, I think like 3 months, we had every Friday set aside a couple of hours or an hour, I think it was, to say, well, let's have a virtual beer together and have a bit of a chat, and that part of it didn't work so well. So maybe your point about it being it's being an activity that we're doing together.
It has to be an activity.
Yes.
Yeah, it has to be an activity. Yeah, the Zoom happy hours, it definitely does not work. It has to be an activity that you do together that's specifically fit for a virtual setting, like gaming or a virtual escape room or some other activities that you can do online in a connected way. All right, so we talked a little bit about socialization and having fun together using native virtual formats, but you mentioned something about brainstorming, and I want to circle back to that. Something that a lot of my clients express fears around is innovation. How do you pursue innovation in remote settings? And I've written about that Harvard Business Review article on virtually synchronous brainstorming, how you can do innovation in remote settings, but there are still a lot of fears. So tell me a little bit more about how you, having an all-remote company from the start, have addressed the need for innovation.
So we're now launching our 5th product, actually here in December 2022.
Great.
And we've never ever had a physical product, a brainstorming session. So it's not like we've tried to replicate what you're doing face to face. We use just electronic sticky notes that we put things up on, and you type it in, and actually having them written means everyone can read it afterwards. You can probably remember, because that's a problem with the real notes. Like, no one can actually read what's there, and actually organizing them afterwards is really difficult. And here we've had a brainstorming session. We do our quarterly planning session. We have little electronic stickers, and we move them around, and we come back, a week or 2 later, and all the stickers are there. We move them around. So it's terribly effective. And the other thing I think that's brainstorming is something that you can have, it just doesn't happen in the workshop. So if you have like a 2-day, offsite, you're supposed to then, that's the 2 days where you get all the great ideas. But that's probably not how we experience it in real life. innovation and the idea comes from talking to customers, listening to what the market is doing. So all those little ideas actually come day by day. And then we have an online discussion group, and we use because we use the Microsoft collaboration stack. So we use one of their products, which is called Yammer, which is sort of their enterprise social network. And you go in and say, well, I talked to a customer, here's an idea, something I've been thinking about, we can do this. And that means that these little ideas actually, like you're planting a seed, and you allow other people in their own time to think about them, reflect. So, whereas I've always felt in a physical room, when you have pressure of time, there will be some opinionated people with loud voices, and their opinion tends to get heard more than maybe those that are not so vocal and need a little bit more time for reflection. So that's why I think actually brainstorming works better. It certainly for us has worked better online than in a room.
Definitely, and that's the issue called production blocking, where people who are lower status, who are more introverted, have trouble contributing to a typical brainstorming session. So yes, definitely the asynchronous brainstorming online works better for those folks. Now, you've been talking about shipping out a product. Can you tell me a little bit more about the context of what SWOOP Analytics does for listeners who are not aware of it?
Yeah, absolutely. We started 7 years ago with trying to solve this challenge of how can we help companies become better communicators and better collaborators. And for many years, there's been this shift from into, I guess, modern collaboration platforms. And we've been working in a remote hybrid setting for many years, and way before the pandemic. It's just accelerated things. So we had again, a lot of organizations are wanting then to find out, well, how can we help this along, and how do we know how well it's working? How do we know if communication flows well within our company? How do we know whether our senior leaders are engaging with our front line? So there's a lot of these things, because those conversations are happening online. They are very keen on getting help and understanding that how that works. And that's kind of the mission of SWOOP Analytics, is to help organizations make collaboration faster and better. And we do that by then having a very, very, very social, behavioral, I guess, perspective on that. So we take that into the analytics part and say, well, how can we help you become better at communicating and collaborating at work? And how can we give you little nudges and help you understand what your communication and collaboration profile is? And this whole thing around social listening for senior leaders to understand what's going on in their organization. What are people talking about? What are their worries, concerns? What's the customer feedback they hear from in the branch network, in a bank or whatever? And so the more that they can listen at scale, and that's the key word here, how can they listen at scale to what's happening in their organizations? And that's what we help them with.
And that sounds like that would be something especially helpful for organizations that are in hybrid and remote settings, because those organizations don't have as much synchronicity, and so they're not able to listen to that office conversations, but you would help them, or more hybrid and remote organizations, do their work better by listening and collaborating. Am I hearing that correct?
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges is if you are the CEO of a large organization, in the old days, you could sort of maybe bump into people in the hallways. Well, now you might be bumping into half of them in the hallways, Sure. And actually probably 90 or 95 or higher percentage of people won't even be in your corporate head office. They are across the country, they're around the world, they're different time zones. So how can you inspire them? How can you bring them with you at scale? And I think you can really only do that online. And that's why senior leaders now in this question trying to learn how to, we call it, talk with their fingers and listen with their fingers. And that means that we have to get used to using the keyboard. And so the written word becomes much more important. And I think that's a real challenge, right? Because the great orators, the great inspiring speeches now would have to be the very inspiring piece of text supported by, a meeting. And that's a whole different collaboration style that I think is, it's one of those big shifts that needs to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, as we're coming to the conclusion of our conversation, is there anything you haven't shared about hybrid and remote work or SWOOP Analytics that you want to finish up with?
I think there's one big lessons learned we've had, and that is that hybrid and remote work is about people working together. There has been an awful lot of focus on the rollout of technology to support hybrid and remote work. And most of that training has been done at the individual level. Let's roll out Teams, let's roll out Zoom, let's ensure that we know how they work. But the thing we haven't done well is to get people to agree on how to use these tools together. We do some very large benchmarking on how people are using collaboration platforms. And what we can see is that a lot of people know how to use them, but they haven't agreed on how to use them together. That creates a lot of stress within organizations, because you might be a fan of we on a Zoom call today, and you might say, well, if you want to talk to me, it'll be a Zoom call. And someone else might be saying, well, if you want to talk to me, you can come into my office. And the third team member might be saying, if you want to talk to me, send me an email. And if that's three of us working together, we've got mayhem. So we have to figure a way of agreeing on how we use the tools. And I think that's another one. So add that to the other challenges we have, and we can really improve how hybrid work works.
Yeah, one of the things I have my clients do is have each staff member create a personal user manual that describes their preferred methods of collaboration, communication, when they prefer times that they prefer to work. So at least when you're communicating to others on your team, you can look up their personal user manual quickly, which is shared or Google Doc or somewhere else like that, SharePoint, and then you know how to communicate to them effectively. So definitely very important point. Okay, thank you very much, Cai. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to the listeners for checking out another podcast episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. I hope you'll leave a review of this podcast wherever you check this out, and please make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you heard us. All right, I look forward to seeing you next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.